Hello world, it's Austin, and it's Friday, which means you know what tomorrow is? Saturday. Yes, it's Saturday, but it's the book release day, and I'm so excited. So I'm here today with my book here, Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians, and I thought I would read you some from it today. I'm gonna do, so tomorrow, Saturday, I'm gonna do a live event on YouTube. I'm gonna stream on YouTube, starting at 1 p.m. Central Time. So come get on YouTube and hang out with me, because I'm going to answer questions, I'm going to read more of the book, and we're just going to have a really good time, I think. And it's also my birthday, so like, it's just a fun thing to do for my birthday and for the book. And yeah, I'm just really excited and proud and happy. So the official book release party is happening here in St. Paul, Minnesota tomorrow night. But I just thought it'd be fun to hang out with all of you who can't make it to the official book release. So, 1 p.m. Central tomorrow, Saturday. But for now, let's just hang out, and I'm going to read you a little bit from the book. So, I'm going to read to you from chapter 4, which is called, "And God said, Let there be marshes." In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. As a kid, I would read those first words in my children's Bible over and over again. Not because I found them particularly interesting, but because I was the kind of person who always started books from the beginning, and I could never seem to get any further into the Bible than Noah and the Ark before I lost interest. I also liked the first story in my picture Bible because it had some of the best illustrations. On one page you had a friendly orange sun, and on the opposite side a shining yellow moon and twinkling stars. Next came an ocean with big waves from the page depicting mountains and forests. Even in the children's Bible, the distinctions God made when creating the universe were obvious. Each bit of the world was broken into pairs and opposites. For a kid who liked order and organization, the story of creation in Genesis 1 was just about perfect. There was a place for everything, and everything was in its place. This kind of structure in Scripture was something that I appreciated up until my teen years, when I began to get a better sense of the way life sometimes falls outside the black and white boundaries. Biologically, I learned that the world isn't separated distinctly into land or sea. There are also marshes, estuaries, and coral reefs. Personally, when I began to figure out more about my own sense of gender identity, I wondered if all people were really divided into male and female, as Genesis 1 seemed to say they were. For a long time, I thought I was the only person worried about this biblical gender separation. Little did I know there was another person halfway across the country asking very similar questions. The Reverend M. Barclay was born and raised in Pensacola, Florida, which was, as they describe it, practically southern Alabama. M grew up in the United Methodist Church, but wasn't particularly invested in the politically and theologically conservative ideals that they saw around them. The idea of genderqueerness or transness was not even remotely on my radar, they explained as we talked one night. I felt different, but I didn't know any gay people. Nobody even talked about it. When M was in high school, they joined some friends who attended a youth group at a large non-denominational church in town. Rather than pews, M found comfy chairs and couches. Rather than hymns, there were praise songs. It felt as if faith was springing up fresh and new, and M took to it like a duck to water. Near the end of high school, they began to discern a call to ministry, but the church M was now attending didn't approve of women in ministry, so as someone assigned female at birth, M hit a brick wall. I was told, women can't be ordained. So it took me 2 years, even when I was read as a cisgender straight woman, to overcome that basic gender barrier. Even though M wasn't fully cognizant of their trans identity at this point, the roadblocks they were facing would become all too familiar. That was the constant struggle, M said. I felt so called to ministry, but people said that Scripture says my call isn't accurate. So M found their way back to the Methodist tradition, where women have been preaching for centuries, from Sarah Mallett in 1787 and Sojourner Truth in 1827 to Maud Keister Jensen, the first woman to receive full clergy rights in 1956. There were more people in the Methodist Church who were helping me struggle through that, M explained. There were Methodist women who were pastors, and I really wanted to engage with them, so that's part of what brought me back. M's faith deepened in college as they began digging into theology and as they met people from outside their conservative Christian bubble. They started studying the Bible through a historical critical lens, which seeks to understand the biblical world and the intentions behind the text in the original language, rather than taking every word literally as we read it in English today. As they read the works of scholars and clergy through the ages, it became clear that there was more than one way to read and interpret the Bible. This was a wonderful and confusing discovery for M, as they realized that not everything they had been taught as a young person was undisputed fact. It also opened their eyes to the possibility that God's acceptance or rejection of LGBTQ+ people might not be an open and shut case, as they had once thought. Shortly out of college, M embarked on their seminary training. Their calling to ministry was as strong as ever, but internally they were struggling with their beliefs about queer identities in the midst of a life of faith. M explained, "One of the most important shifts for me in terms of understanding identities came when I was in seminary. I remember a key moment watching my best friend come out. He's a gay guy, and I was almost there when it came to fully accepting LGBT people, but I hadn't quite worked it all out yet theologically. But watching him come to life over the course of his coming out process just sealed the deal for me. My friend's coming out wasn't opposed to my understanding of God as love, as the one who creates, as the one who brings forth life in each of us." After witnessing this, M's metric for measuring a life of faith was changed. They said, "My understanding of Scripture became filtered through this question. Does this behavior or identity or way of being in the world create life within a person or within that community?" When we read about the way God creates life in Genesis 1, it begins with the separation of light and darkness, and by extension, the creation of day and night. Next, God divides the waters of the deep into two categories, the waters above the sky and the waters below the sky. Then those waters below the sky are parted and separated and gathered together to create two separate domains, the land and the sea. God populates the sea with birds, the sky with birds, the sea with fish and other ocean creatures, and the earth with plants and land animals. With each act of creation, from verse 1 to verse 25, God is separating, categorizing, and bringing order out of chaos. For the Hebrew people of the ancient world, these acts of separation and ordering were intimately familiar. The Torah laws that defined them and identified them as God's people were based on these acts of separation between sacred and profane, between the commendable and the abominable. In Deuteronomy 14, a chapter full of examples of this kind of separation, we find one of God's commandments to the Hebrew people regarding food. Deuteronomy 14:9 through 10, we read that sea creatures that have both scales and fins may be eaten, but if they have only one of these characteristics, they're considered unclean and not fit for eating. Scholars and Jewish leaders have debated the reasoning behind these rules God lays out in the first 5 books of the Bible, and there are dozens of plausible theories. What's obvious is that rules like these not only made it easier for God's people to identify good food from possibly dangerous food, they also created ideological boxes that help people understand the world around them. So, imagine you're an ancient Hebrew fisherman, out casting your nets into the sea. When you drag up your net, you find a few mackerel, a jellyfish, and a lobster. You take one look at the scales and fins of the mackerel and think, fish. You know without a doubt that's a fish, and it's good to eat. But what if you've never seen a jellyfish or a lobster before? Are they fish? You can't see any fins or scales, so therefore they are outside the category of fish, and it can't be eaten. Though you may live your whole life without experiencing the wonder of garlic butter lobster tail, you also miss out on being stung in the mouth by the jellyfish. These categories kept people safe and helped to order the world. Because these categories applied to every part of life, from the grain in the fields to the dinner table to the temple sacrifices, it's not surprising to find the same kinds of separation in the Genesis 1 creation account. Almost all of this first chapter deals in dualities like light and dark, earth and sky, land and water, and then we get to verse 27. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Based on the dualities we've seen in this chapter, it's not surprising to find that humans broke into two groups here. Male and female, God created them. But this verse does not discredit other sexes or genders any more than the verse about the separation of day from night rejects the existence of dawn and dusk. As M. Barclay puts it, this chapter talks about night and day and land and water, but we have dusk and we have marshes. These verses don't mean there's only land and water, and there's nowhere where these two meet. These binaries aren't meant to speak to all of reality. They invite us into thinking about everything between and beyond. In the same way that we call God the Alpha and the Omega, implying all things from first to last and in between, the author of Genesis is merely using the same dualistic poetic device to corral the infinite diversity of creation into categories we can easily understand. The reality is that for as long as there have been humans, there have been people who fall outside of the male-female binary. In the creation story from Sumer, another Mesopotamian society, and a neighbor to what would become Israel, we find references from 1600 BC to humans who are created with sex organs that are not immediately identifiable as female or male. In the Mishnah and the Talmud, the Jewish compilations of oral law put together between 200 CE and 500 CE, We see several examples of individuals who don't fit male or female categories within Jewish culture, including those whose sex is indeterminable, those who have characteristics of more than one sex, and those whose characteristics change over time. This tells us that even the descendants of the Hebrew people who recorded Genesis 1 did not necessarily assume the gender or sex categories seen in verse 27 were all-encompassing. In Greek and Roman times, people born with indeterminate or ambiguous sex characteristics were called hermaphrodites, after a Greek god who exhibited both female and male traits. Today, people with a combination of different sex characteristics identify themselves as intersex, and we know that they make up between 0.018% and 1.7% of the world's population. Throughout history, doctors have attempted to fix intersex infants through surgical intervention before a child can make any decisions for themselves, and sometimes even without the knowledge or consent of the parents. Fortunately, intersex advocates all over the world are finally seeing the positive results of their push for self-determination, and groups like the Intersex Society of North America are helping to stop the modification of babies identified as intersex at birth. All this begins to tell us that the interactions between chromosomes, hormone production, and physiology are much more complicated than we once thought. Not all people are born male or female, and if we try to force that binary, we put ourselves in the position of claiming to know better than God. As theologian and specialist on intersex issues Megan DeFranza put it, the simplistic binary sex model is no longer sufficient. It is dishonest to the diversity of persons created in the image of God. When we attempt to box God's creation in by looking to Genesis 1:21 or 1:27 and expecting every person on earth to fall into that line, we're asking the text the wrong question. If Genesis 1 was meant to describe the world as it is, the biblical authors would have needed a scroll hundreds of feet long. Thank goodness we don't have to slog through verse after verse that reads like a biology textbook on taxonomy, naming creature after creature from the elephant to the paramecium. Just as we wouldn't expect astronomers to cram things like comets and black holes into the categories for sun and moon we see in Genesis, we also shouldn't expect all humans to fit into the categories of male and female just because those are the only two listed here. Instead of asking the text to define and label all that is, we can ask God to speak into the space between the words, between biblical times and our times, and between categories we see as opposites. When I asked M. Barclay if they identified with the concept of in-between places in space and time, their answer surprised me. I had always assumed that all non-binary people identified somewhere between male and female, but as M explained, that's a fairly common misconception. While the term non-binary has become a simple way to refer to someone who doesn't have a strict male or female gender identity, the term is intrinsically flawed. To say that you're non-binary innately suggests that there is a binary, and my whole point is that there's no such thing, M clarified. We've created this formula and forced our understanding of gender into it. Instead of seeing ourselves as halfway between male and female, M and many other non-binary people identify as something completely different. I'm very convicted to speak about my own non-binary identity not as an in-between, but as a more, M told me. So for instance, as someone who's bisexual, I don't think of myself as half gay and half straight. I'm something else. I know some non-binary people think of themselves as half man and half woman, but I don't. When we open the gender binary boxes, it's much more of a scattering of things than a line. So that's where I'm going to stop for now, because there's more to the chapter, but I think I don't want to give away too much. So, yeah, basically the book is a whole combination of biblical scholarship and modern narratives like M's, and I'm so happy and proud of the way this book has turned out, and I hope that it helps folks who need a resource that they can read to, like, not only explain their identities to other people, but also something that they can read to help remind themselves that they're not alone out there. So, I hope you enjoyed that. Remember, I'm going to be back here tomorrow, 1 p.m. Central Time, to hang out, so come hang out with me, and yeah, I'll see you then, everybody. Peace.